Isquis Chichawasket, Pamela Barnes. It's my honor today to formally welcome you to the Syilx territory. And so before I do that, I want to share with you a little bit about what our lands mean to us. In this part of Turtle Island, which is how we refer to North America, the sharing of our lands with peoples from other places is fairly recent. It's about 200 years. Where other parts of Turtle Island, that history goes back 500 years, 1,000 years, depending on where you're speaking of. But here it's fairly recent. And with those coming together of different peoples from different places, came some new ideas about human relationship to the land, and that are very different from our traditional viewpoint about our relationship to the lands. And so one of those concepts is the idea of ownership, human ownership of land. And we as Syilx people see ourselves more of borrowing these lands from our great, 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 great grandchildren. We look at things in 7 generations. And there's a very big difference between those two ideas. So if I own this necklace, I can sell it, I can trade it, I can give it away. It's mine, I can do what I want. It's up to me how I choose to care for it. I can take great care or I can toss it aside. Again, it's mine. I can do what I want with it. If I borrow this necklace, everything changes in those relationships. I cannot sell it. I cannot trade it. I cannot give it away. And there's an expectation that I take the very best care possible. And when I leave it or return it, that at least it's in the same condition I found it in, and if at all possible, in better. So those ideas are very different. And it's with that understanding of our relationship to these lands that we first welcomed people to the traditional unceded territory of the Syilx people. And so it's with that understanding that today I welcome you to the traditional unceded and currently occupied territory of the Syilx people, with the gentle reminder that none of us, including ourselves as Syilx people, are taking the very best care possible of these lands for all of our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth. Lyndon.
So hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Victoria Burge, and I'm coming to you today as an uninvited guest on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. As the education coordinator of adult programming here at the Kelowna Art Gallery, and on behalf of the board of directors and staff, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we operate, gather, and benefit every day on the land of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. Today, we gather online from many parts of Turtle Island to learn more about the making of the Witness Blanket, which stands as a monument to the atrocities committed by the Canadian residential school system. We also welcome any survivors and elders that may be joining us, and wish that with your guidance, we can continue to learn, challenge, and hopefully inspire change in our colonialist built society. With that being said, I'd like to move forward and welcome tonight's guest, Carey Newman, a Kwakwaka'wakw and Sto multi-disciplinary artist, master carver, scholar, filmmaker, author, and public speaker. In his artistic practice, he strives to highlight either Indigenous, social, or environmental issues. He's also interested in engaging with community and incorporating innovative methods derived from traditional teachings and Indigenous worldviews into his process. Newman was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal in 2017 and was named to the Order of British Columbia in 2018. And he was recently appointed as the Impact Chair for Indigenous Art Practices at the University of Victoria. And Victoria is where he is joining us from tonight. So welcome, Carey. Just a few housekeeping rules before I hand it over. Normally, I would tell everyone to save their questions until the end, but Carey has politely offered to answer any relevant questions throughout the talk. So if you do have something in the moment that you would like answered, just let me know, and I can kindly interrupt Carey to get an answer to that question. All you need to do to ask the question is to enter it into the chat bar below, and I'll do my best to get them all answered before the end of our talk this evening. It's also important to note that today's lecture is being recorded for future viewing, so if you know of anyone who would like to check it out at a later date, it will be available on our website. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. I'll pass it over to you, Carey.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here to give this talk. I am coming to you from the traditional territories of the Kwakwaka'wakw speaking people, currently known as Victoria. It's nearby where I grew up, in Sauk territory. As Victoria said, my name is Carey Newman. My traditional name is Hayalthkin'geme. I come from the Kwakwaka'wakw, Gixam, and Wawallabai clans of the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, which is on the northern end of Vancouver Island, as well as from Chiam of the Sto Nation along the Upper Fraser Valley. That's through my grandmother. And on my mother's side, I'm English, Irish, Scottish, settler stock from Saskatchewan. I am the maker of the witness blanket, but I should, you'll see, we'll talk about the process a little bit, that is only one small part of it, because really what the witness blanket is made from are so many different stories. So many different objects, and it was put together with the help of a lot of different people and from different places. So I'm just gonna get into my screen share mode here and see. Hold on a second. I love it when you go to pick the screen share and the one that you want to show isn't showing up. Hold on a second. Oh, there we go. I think I found it. I found how to find it. Yep. Okay. I believe I'm screen sharing now, and I can see you, Victoria. If you're nodding your head, then you can see picking up the pieces. So I guess I thought I would talk a little bit about this story, and I'll start by telling it through the way that my friend Kirsty Hudson and I told the story of the witness blanket, which was through this book called Picking Up the Pieces, Residential School Memories and the Making of the Witness Blanket. When I started out on this journey, it was 2010. I was about to become a father for the first time, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had started, and they had released a call for commemoration initiatives. Being the son of a residential school survivor, my father, Victor, went to both the school at Seashelt and the school in Mission. And being an artist, I tried to think of what I could make, what I could do. how I could respond to that call. And in my general practice, I'm a carver, a jeweler, a designer of different things. And so I had kind of, that's where my mind began, right? I was thinking about how I could make a totem, how I could tell the story of residential school experience. And I realized through thinking about each of the things that I had made before, that it would be incredibly difficult to tell the breadth or scope of story that I wanted to tell through the things that I had done before. Because no matter how much meaning I tried to put into a totem, no matter how large I made a sculpture, I didn't think that it could begin to encompass the experiences that I knew were part of residential schools. And it wasn't until I was sitting in this very room and with my feet up on this little stool that's made of pieces of wood that are linked together and they fold up like a director's chair, that I looked down at my feet and thought, what if I made a blanket out of objects from schools? And that's where the idea began. And I thought of that idea in 2011, but I didn't make the application. I had about a month before the application deadline. I didn't make the application for the first round because it had said in the call that they were going to do one call for the first year and another call for the year after. And the reason I didn't make the application is because I thought that the idea was too new and that there was no way that I would be able to properly articulate such a big ask in a month. And so I took that whole year to think about this project. And from that extra time, it grew from being just about getting pieces from schools to wanting to tell the whole story. Like, how did the schools begin? Well, governments created them. How were they run? Churches. And what was under attack? What was, when we talk about why schools were made, what was their purpose? Their purpose, from what I've read and from what I've heard and from what I think most of us now understand, was to, quote, take the Indian out of the child, right? It was to break apart First Nations communities, disrupt language, and assimilate us one way or another into the quote Canadian identity. And so I realized that to tell this story, it had to include pieces from government buildings. It had to include churches, and it needed to show evidence that the attempts, although may be successful in some individual instances, like I don't speak my language, it was not successful in that I still got to grow up practicing and knowing about my culture. And we see it in friendship centers, and we see it in sweat lodges, and we see it in the different ways that Indigenous people express resurgence and show resilience. And so that brought in a lot of more contemporary buildings, and that became the idea that I put forward. And that's why I feel really good about taking that extra time, because I think that giving an idea the time it needs to grow into its full potential is a critical element of art making, especially when you're taking on something that has such significance, such importance, and there's a weight of responsibility that comes along with it. And I think that was another part of the reason why I decided to take extra time. So here's me and Kirsty. This is my friend who I actually met during the process of making the blanket, because Kirsty was a producer for CBC radio here in Victoria, and a couple of times we did. She interviewed me like as a producer pre-interview before the going on air part, and so we kind of got to know each other a little bit. And when the blanket was finished and the idea came around about making a book about it, she was looking for a place to start writing. She really wanted to do that. We were friends, and I thought, what better way to model the process of reconciliation, of reconciling, than for a non-Indigenous person to work with me in telling this story. And it, as an aside, it was really great for me because I can say the words and I can think about the things that I want to say and put into the pages. But when it comes to sitting in front of a computer and typing them all out, I start getting stuck on which word goes in what order. It's much different than when I'm talking to everybody here or participating in an interview. And so because Kirsty was experienced with interviewing, that's how we did it. We would talk about what the chapters would look like, and then I would sit and she would basically interview me about any given chapter, any part of the story. And then she would rough it into form, and then she would work on the research part and I would work on the narrative part. So it was a really positive and symbiotic experience. I also want to talk about the purpose that I assigned to my artistic practice. I want my work to be about sharing truth. This is something that came much clearer through the process of making the Witness Blanket, but it started beforehand. Back in 2008, I did a project called the Spirit Pole. And we took this pole around to communities all over British Columbia as part of BC 150 and the North American Indigenous Games. And that was my first experience with sort of a community collaborative project. And it was also part of the influence that led me to the idea of working in the way that I worked for making the blanket. When you start working with community, you start recognizing responsibility. And so I think about my purpose as having responsibility. I need to share truth, no matter what it is I'm making. I care deeply about these lands that are below us and all around us, the air, the water. So protecting them is critical to me. And I'll show you a little bit further on in my presentation a project that deals with that. And also I want my work to be able to participate in uplifting community, because no matter how terrible the experiences have been for Indigenous people in this country, if I allow myself to become channeled into only being defined by the worst of what's happened, then where's the hope? What is it that makes it matter? And so community makes it matter. My daughter makes it matter. Teaching in university and seeing people come to different conclusions about what justice is makes it matter. And I'm not saying that my work does all of those things, but it participates in small ways in these things, and that's what makes it important to me. Another thing that surfaces time and time again in my work is the idea of connection to or honoring of the past, respect for the present, and taking responsibility for the future. So there's this sort of continuation of past, present, and future. that exists in a lot of the work that I do. And in looking back at the witness blanket, I can see each of those elements present in the mindset that I was in when I was thinking about what to do and how to do it. Another thing that is pretty critical to me is this word, Owitnakyola. It's a Kwakwaka'wakw word. It means to live in good relationship with the land, air, water, spirit worlds, and everything in them. And I include in that things like technology, this way that we're communicating right now, even through a pandemic that makes it so much more difficult for us to gather and travel and all of those things. I've been able to be present for different stops of the Witness Blanket exhibit while it tours, and to meet with and talk with people. And technology has so much potential to do good, to be a positive part of this world. And it's also one of the things that's complicit in creating a lot of the issues that we're facing, whether it's climate related, resource related, economic, whether it's the dissemination of information and the way that because it's so immediate, we don't have necessarily the same type of social contract of etiquette for how we respond to each other in this environment, where you can just fire off a comment on Twitter without the same kind of accountability as if you're sitting across the table from somebody. And I think that kind of as a society, we're still learning how to be in good relationship with technology. So I try, whenever I'm working on something, to think about each of those things that I've just outlined as aspects of the work that I'm planning and the work that I'm doing. The last thing that I want to bring up is this idea of the agency of a thing, the rights that objects have, that stories have. In our Kwakwaka'wakw traditions, we will give people a song, but we don't give it to them like a piece of property, like they can take it and put it in their pocket and sell it to somebody else. We give it to them as more of a relationship, where whenever they sing the song, they say, this song was given to me by, and then they share it under that agreement, because the song has rights, and the rights that are being expressed in the singing of it are shared between the person who gave it, or the family who gave it, and the person who's singing it. We have similar kinds of ideas around our masks, how they are not just an object that represents something, they actually are an ancestor. So I have a mask in my family called the Nu'ulis mask, and it tells the beginning of our ancestry. And one of them's at a museum in Berlin, one of them's at the Museum of Anthropology, and the other one is in our family box of treasures. And we think of it as having a life of its own. We sing a song to it when we wake it from sleep. And then we dance it. And then when it's time for it to go back into the box of treasures and to sleep again, we sing another song and wrap it in blankets before putting it away. This speaks to the way that we think about the things that we have, that they're not just a thing. They're not a piece of property. They're an entity. They have agency and they have rights. And if during the process of making a witness blanket, I really thought about those things. And I'm going to tell you the story of this shoe that we're looking at right now, because this shoe came from, here, I'll skip forward to there, came from the site of a burned down residential school in Carcross in the Yukon. And when it was gathered, that's Rosie's hand that's holding it. She had been going through the site, speaking to the person who was there and showing her around, and they saw this. They found this shoe, and they thought, well, he kind of pointed it out in the bush and said, hey, maybe you want something like that. And so they pulled it out, and you could see in this picture the moss that was still growing from it. Rosie, who was part of the collection team, she brought it, she put it in a box in her bed and breakfast, and she went to sleep. But that night, she woke up in the middle of the night having a terrible nightmare. She was running in her sleep, and she was afraid. And she kind of put it off to travel. She'd been traveling all over the country, gathering objects with a witness blanket, and she'd been so many places. So even though she's not a person who has vivid dreams like that, she was just like, wow, I'm just like I've really worn myself down. The next day she came home here to Victoria, and she dropped her bags and had dinner with her husband, Shane. And that evening, Shane had a nightmare, and he was running in bed. And when Rosie woke him up and he explained his dream, she realized it was the same dream. And this was one of the very first pieces that we got. We traveled all over the place trying to get the idea out there and get people to start giving us, sharing their objects with us. But this was pretty early on. So because they'd had the same dream, Rosie thought, oh, well, it must be the shoe. It's the only thing that's been in both places. So she got out of bed the next morning, and she showed up at my door, and she knocked. It was like 8 o'clock in the morning, which is super early for me, or it was before I had kids. And she told me the story of the nightmare she'd had, and she gave me the shoe and said, I didn't feel like I could give it to you without an explanation. So I wasn't sure what to do, but I took it in to my studio in my basement. And that night before I went to bed, I went down and I opened the box, and I took out the shoe and I held it. And I don't consider myself to be an overly spiritual person. I believe in the ways of my ancestors, of our cultural teachings. But I have never been the conduit of that kind of spirituality before. But I could feel the anger and the fear in the shoe as I held it. And I was overcome by emotion as I held it. And I didn't know what to do other than to begin to speak. And so I had conversations with the shoe on several nights in a row, where I would take it from its box and place it in my studio and talk about the project, to say what it was I was trying to do, what this blanket was meant to become. And each night, the feeling I had when I held it was a little bit different. And it went from angry to fearful to sadness. And so I'll skip back now. You'll see this is a picture of the shoe on the blanket. It's bound in medicine cloth. It is wrapped. It has wheatgrass wrapped around it. And if I pulled back a little bit, which I can't in this photograph, you'd see sage above and below. And I did that because I realized in that experience that the objects that were coming in to be part of the witness blanket needed to be treated with the same level of respect and dignity as the people who were asking to share their stories and to share the pieces in the first place. And I felt the pain that this shoe has experienced. And so the medicine on and around it was my response to that. Of course, I can't, when a work is 40 feet long, treat all of them in the exact same way. But I did try to, where possible, include the medicine that an object would come with in how I attached it to the blanket. And so you'll see pieces mounted on cloth. That cloth came, the piece came wrapped in that cloth. And that's my way of acknowledging the traditions of the place that it came from. If it came with a piece of sweetgrass or sage, then I try to have that in close proximity. And that kind of thinking has kind of started to transform me and who I am and how I think about my work as an artist. There's a great deal of responsibility that comes along with making something like this. It's based in trust. It's based in relationship. It's based in reciprocity. So those things were all present in my mind and in my heart as I was making this, and I got a lot of help from a lot of different people. There was my friend Colin, who's an expert in construction, and he helped me envision, test, and then eventually build the background and the frame of the witness blanket. There are conservators who gave their expertise on how to mount these textiles and these different objects in ways that would ensure that they're that I wasn't ruining them, that they would be able to be there for a good long time. I don't really believe that artwork of any fashion, of at least of my own, is meant to be here forever. I'm not interested in that. I take that because we have teachings about totems that they're meant to go back into the earth. And for me, I think that's kind of a beautiful way of creating space for the future. Because if we all just made things that lasted forever, then there's not enough space for the stories of tomorrow. So I think about that, right, in the process of conservation. The witness blanket has a job and a purpose and a story to tell. And it will have done its job when it's no longer necessary to tell these stories, because everybody knows. I don't know if that'll happen during my lifetime. In fact, I don't think that it will. But I also don't think that there's a lot of hopefulness in saying, well, we need to have this forever, because the goal is for it to be to do its part in sharing truth, and to eventually make way for the stories of the future. I'm going to show you a couple of images from along the way. There's the shoe. This is my father, Victor. He is the man who inspired me to make the blanket in the first place. He's a residential school survivor. He's a carver. He taught me so much about how to do what I do. Yeah, it's pretty special to have been able to go through the process of making this blanket with and for him. Here are some pictures of the rest of our family, and these are actually on the blanket. There's, over on the right here, the little boy sitting on the train in front of the Christmas tree. That's my dad. And isn't he cute? Look at those cheeks. But the sad part about this is that was his last Christmas at home before he went to residential school. Over here is my grandmother with some of my aunties and uncles. And And here we are when we went to to St. Mary's and Mission. And when I started making the blanket, I didn't know what I was going to get from everybody else, but I knew that for my piece, I was going to get a branch from an apple tree in the orchard at the site of the mission school, St. Mary's and Mission, because my dad had told me a story about his experience there and how he got kicked out of residential school because he stole the holy wine. This slideshow is taking off on its own. He and the others boys would get the smallest amongst them to crawl under the stone steps into the cellar, and they would roll jars down and then fill them with the wine and then take them out, and they would go and drink them in the orchard. When this was discovered, they were told that if the guilty didn't come forward, then everybody would be punished. And so my dad, knowing that he was one of them and being a person who would wanted to protect others, stepped forward and said it was me. And he was punished and he was expelled from residential school. And I think it was after his grade 9 year. And to give you an idea of how confusing and difficult it was for him, even though he'd been expelled, he still came back the next year. And when he showed up, they said, no, we don't want you here anymore. And so he'd kind of set himself free in a way through this little act of resistance. And at the time, when he told me about this when we were kids, I thought, oh, my dad's like a badass. Like that was sort of what I thought about when I was younger. But then you get older and you start thinking about the kinds of, like, what that means, right? His decision to step forward and take responsibility. And the story kind of like, it doesn't change, but it changes meaning a little bit, because with the experience of having been through situations myself where sometimes I might have taken responsibility and other times I might have tried to avoid responsibility. That story always makes me really, really proud of my dad, both for the resistance, but also for the care he was expressing. So all the objects on the blanket have stories. All of them came through some form of relationship that was built with me or one of the members of the team. By taking on the responsibility that comes with an object, the witness blanket became something more than a piece of artwork. And when I say that, I don't mean greater than, I just mean that my relationship with it was different, because I couldn't sell it and absolve myself of the responsibility that I had accepted by accepting these pieces. So when the witness blanket was finished, it went on tour. It traveled to many different places, from this coast to the East Coast, and back and forth in between. And one of the places that it stopped was in Winnipeg at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And while it was there, somebody asked me, when the tour is finished, do you think that there's any chance that you'll bring the blanket here to stay? And I hadn't found a place for it, but I did think that it would be a pretty significant location, both because it's at the heart of these lands. It was the where the museum is built is sort of at the heart of Indigenous historical trading routes. And the tour was intended to bring it back to everywhere that it had come from. And we had realized at a certain point that we weren't going to be able to meet that goal because there was so many there were so many places for it to go, and because the wear and tear of it being on the road and being packed up and set up and taken down and packed up and moved again, we realized we had to end the tour. So we set about the conversation of where it would stay, and I engaged a conversation with the Museum for Human Rights about whether or not we would be able to bring it there, and they were very interested. And I told them this story about how I couldn't sell them the blanket because that was what they asked. Like, well, how much is it? And I said, I don't think I could sell it, but I also can't just give it to you. For it to occur, we have to figure out a way to continue that relational rather than transactional way of thinking of the witness blanket. And it led to what we call a stewardship agreement that is sort of based in Kwakwaka'wakw traditions. And it acknowledges the rights that the blanket has and the stories that it carries. And rather than the museum gaining a piece of property or gaining rights, like in the form of copyrights or moral rights, or story rights, they accepted to share the responsibility that I was carrying, that my team was carrying, and that all rights would exist with the blanket. And so it's a sort of a structural shift for a Crown Corporation to invest in, because I did include a financial component, and the financial component was for the museum to pay forward or to invest into the project the same amount of money that survivors put into making the blanket in the first place. And the reason I say that is because the TRC was created by the IRSSA, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And when they were negotiating that settlement, survivors said, we want commemoration initiatives, and survivors set aside $20 million from their settlement to address commemoration. So all the projects that came out of that call that led to this witness blanket were literally paid for by survivors. The original ask for the witness blanket was just under $1 million. And by the time we built the frames for the tour and sent it around the country for a little while, it was a little over $1 million. So that was what I asked for the museum from a financial standpoint, was for them to reinvest into it. And that investment has led to things like the exhibit that's in Kelowna right now, because we paid for that out of this agreement. It also made the documentary that we made freely available, because we didn't have any funding to make the documentary, so we sort of just racked up debt to get it made, and they paid off that investment that me and Media One had put into. We recognized the story was important to tell, and so that also was part of this agreement. And it's also led to some legacy opportunity. When we wrote the agreement, you saw that there is, I mean, you can't really see it, but it's part of the written agreement. So there is a contract that we did sign, but we also enacted it through ceremony, where the museum and me both stood up and spoke to our intentions. And then we called witnesses to stand up and speak back to us what they had heard. And so now the witnesses and me and the museum are all in, we all share that responsibility of acting in the best interest of the witness blanket. When I said that there was a legacy component that we've been raising money for this, and what I wanted to do was to create a space where more artists could make more artwork like the witness blanket that addresses the different injustices that we face in this world. And what that looks like right now is what I'm calling the Uncenter for Arts and Decolonization, where it's about bringing people together from all different walks of life, from all different areas of research and creative practice, to work together in maybe a less colonial process of creation. And I'm taking up the legacy money from the agreement with the museum to help to establish this Uncenter. What I would like to see happen there is for it to address systemic issues that impact us all, and to do it through art and through Indigenous knowledges, because I think that both of those two things have an incredibly important role to play in the way that we make change in this world. When scholars get together and talk about how do we make big change, like how do we actually decolonize, or how do we address systemic racism, they talk about how a system needs to become aware of itself. So people have to first recognize that there's a problem in the first place. And they also know that creative process and transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary process is important in helping people to come to that realization. But because most scholars are not artists, they don't have the tools to do that. So what I want to see in this Uncenter is a place where artists and scholars, and artists who are scholars and scholars who are artists can work together on addressing these big issues. I want to see collaboration there happen in a different way. I don't want to see scholars going into communities to mine us for our knowledge that they then take away and turn into a paper about something, where they're proposing a solution that's inspired by the things that we know. So I want it to be based in reciprocity. I want it to mirror some of those value systems that I spoke about at the beginning of this presentation. And when it comes to transformation, I really believe this. When something becomes personal, it becomes important. And once it's important, that's when most of us are ready to make ourselves a little bit uncomfortable, to do something a little bit different than we've done before. And that's how things change, right? How many times have any of you heard people say, oh, I didn't realize that before, when we're talking about residential schools? I've heard it a lot, and I continue to hear it. And what I try to say when people tell me that is, well, now that you know, you can never unknow. And so you can't use this excuse again, right? We have to allow those moments that are moments of realization to affect us in a way that turns us towards change. I've seen it happen in relationship to the witness blanket. I've seen the stories that are attached to it have impacts on people that connect to things that are important to them. And I truly believe that the projects that have come out of it, because we're doing digital projects and we've got this exhibition that's moving around, and we're making another exhibition, and we have the documentary in the book that I mentioned. These have all come through the suggestion, through the efforts of others. I've maybe participated in them, but I didn't initiate them. And every time that a new project is initiated, usually there's a story about why. And usually that story is connected in some way to both something from a person's own experience and how that's connected to a piece on the blanket, whether that's a hockey skate, a braid of hair, a shoe, a set of piano keys, something on there connected. And that's what has led to this sort of idea where people are ready to make change. Another thing that came out of the process of making the witness blanket was the idea of collective truth. That when you work with community, it's different than working alone. And I've already spoken about the responsibility that comes with that and how that responsibility led me to a different way of thinking about what the blanket is. That idea of responsibility continues with me now. It's bled into all of the different kinds of work that I do. And I can no longer, just in the way that I've just sort of made the plea that if you've said before, oh, I didn't realize that before, you can't go back. I've had similar realizations of my own. And once we know that, it becomes our responsibility, right? To stand up. What does it mean to be a witness? It means you have to stand up. It means that you have to speak your truth, the things that you learn. And that's what it means to bear witness. And that's what brings me to, and I'm going to try to wrap this up really quickly because I know I've been talking for a long time, but this is a project that I'm working on now, and it's called The Seedling. You can see on the screen here that my plan is to plant a Western red cedar seedling, and that I will design a 3D rendering of a totem. And the University of Victoria has committed to making and installing the pole when this tree is mature. The timeline for this project is 450 to 600 years. And it's a simple idea, but it brings up a whole bunch of really cool and challenging obstacles. Because how do you even make an agreement that lasts that long? Well, maybe we plant the tree on a piece of land, and we don't think about that land as property. We think of it as having its own rights, the same way the witness blanket does. So I'm working with some Indigenous legal scholars and some Western legal scholars to figure out a way to give land its own title, and which would emancipate it from the system of property. It would change our relationship with land. In the same way as that agreement with the museum is just a small step in structural change. If we took a plot of land where a tree was growing and we changed its designation to something that doesn't exist, well, it does, because there are other places in the world that have recognized the rights of things, but if it owned itself and we had responsibility for looking after it rather than ownership, or we were the lords of the land, then we've changed that. What about if we gave the tree a voice in governance? What if we gave it a seat for UVic, the Board of Governors? But what if we actually started making decisions in this world, political decisions, not just based on our metrics of economy, but what about the needs of the land itself? Because we are of the land. In this idea of a Wheatnikyola, we can't separate ourselves from that. So that's another challenge that comes up with this project. How do you make something, a piece of technology, that lasts? Like my phone, it gets updated like every 5 days, it feels like, and I get a new phone every 2 years. because these things are designed to wear out. And so even though technology can be a huge part of a solution, it's also part of the problem when it comes to resource extraction. So figuring out more sustainable uses of technologies is another aspect of this project. And there's a whole bunch more, but I don't have very many more minutes, and I want to leave some time for some questions. So I'm going to close it there on the kind of uplifting note of changing from looking backwards in time to the past, and looking here in the present to imagining a different future that's based on some of these ways of thinking that have lived on these lands, that have come from these lands since time immemorial. So I will say, Gilakasla Hemas, that is everything.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Carey. Wonderful, wonderful lecture and wonderful teachings, and it's really excellent to see where you're moving forward, and really cool idea to say the least with the tree. And we already have some excellent questions pouring in here, and some words, some well wishes, so that's really great. So with the time we have left, I will bring up a couple of questions, and feel free to answer them for us. So we will go back to the first one here. Let's see. Susan is asking, what would you want to see, or how would you describe reconciliation? Big question.
I think reconciliation is a process. It's about building or restoring good relationship. I think that it includes land. It includes truth. And I think of it as a journey, and every once in a while there'll be an event that occurs, like the confirmation of unmarked graves, that give us an indication not only of how far we've come based on the response, but how far we still have to go. Because sometimes we see, sometimes the mile markers are positive and sometimes they're negative, and the negative ones just show us how far we have still to go before we get to truth. And the ones that are more positive show us how far we've come along the way. I think that's a question that a lot of people would love to have a succinct answer for, but reconciliation is going to be messy. It's going to continue for a long time. It's going to take commitment from all levels of human, from politic, from corporation, and really honestly, when I think about what we will need to be able to live in a more sustainable manner in this world, it's going to have to include our practices, like how we run our industries. Because when we talk about land back, and what I mean is changing our relationship with land. It's not give me property. It's not transfer land in the Western paradigm of property ownership. It's reset our collective values and relationship with land so that we consider not only what we need, but what future generations are going to need.
Yeah, absolutely. That past, present, and future, like you mentioned in your talk. Thank you. I have a question from Wendy asking, why is it called a blanket? Or I know it's mentioned in the documentary quite a bit, but perhaps you could give us your view on your ideas of a blanket.
Sure. I know that particularly with the exhibit that's there, it's a little bit harder to envision it as a blanket, but what you can't see there is that all of those pieces are strung together. So if you ever get a chance to go to Winnipeg and see the original blanket, if you push it, it'll move. You can see people walking on the other side of it because it is woven together over steel cables. So it's partly symbol of blanket, but it does have elements of what a blanket is. And the reason that I thought it should be a blanket is because of its universal use for protection, for healing, for identity. We wrap our babies in them when we're born, and we wrap our loved ones in them when they move on to another world. So across cultures, across this planet, people have an understanding of what a blanket means. And that's why I chose blanket.
Excellent, thank you. Annabelle is asking, have you thought of planting 3 trees to make the totem possible, even if one tree dies?
Yes, there is a plan in place to plant many more than 1 trees. The idea, I mean, it sounds better poetically when we say the seedling, but you're absolutely right. There's no guarantee that any tree is going to grow straight enough, tall enough for a long enough time to become a totem. So I'm looking at the possibility of repeating this, both having trees planted in more than 1 tree planted on this plot of land, but also to have just to maybe extend the invitation to other municipalities and corporations and institutions to do something similar, where they are also growing trees, and we follow the growth trajectory of them, because we're in a time that has the potential uncertainty of us not being even able to grow a Western red cedar anymore, because they can't sustain more than a certain number of days of drought, and we're getting pretty close to, with these heat domes and things, pretty close to not being a rainforest anymore. I just have to open the door.
Oh, yep. I'll briefly answer Dorothy's question. She's asking how long the witness blanket will be on display. And we will have the reproduction witness blanket here at the Kelowna Art Gallery until April 10th. So still plenty of time to come down and check it out. Okay. Oh, another question here from Margaret, asking where the Uncenter is to be located. Is it in Victoria? Is that your plan?
The plan is for the Uncenter to be part of the University of Victoria, but I haven't decided on a location, a specific location, because I think that to make a center that's the way that the Uncenter is, we need to bring in lots of different people who think in lots of different ways. And so I don't even know what the building will look like until I know what the processes will be, and I can't do that until I bring together all those people. So the next step, which is going to happen this spring, will be to convene all of those artists, knowledge keepers, and scholars from different parts of this country and world to envision what the Uncenter should become.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Just quite a few questions, so I'm just may not get to everybody. I've got one here from Jack asking, are you planning to add more panels like each of the unmarked graves, possibly 215? Is there any plans to expand the witness blanket?
Not in its physical form. In some of the digital projects that we're working on, we're thinking about different ways of expanding the number of stories that we tell and the way that we tell the stories. But we don't. I don't think that there's a way to continue to build more panels. Um, that said, the blanket continues to gather pieces everywhere that it's gone. People put things on the boxes. And so I guess there is a way, in some ways, that's occurred whether we plan for it or not.
Excellent. Yeah, perhaps another project. Question here from Susan. Are you satisfied that with the exhibition, are you satisfied that the exhibition in Kelowna represents the goals of your original work? For example, using photos and being based on may not have the same impact or tell the same powerful story. So how do you feel about the reproduction being traveling?
I was pretty concerned about it when we first decided that we would try that. I had the benefit of having it just down the street from me in Victoria before it came to Kelowna. And I went there. I went there for a couple of documentary screenings, to tour some classrooms through. And because of my relationship with the original blanket, I thought that it wouldn't have this. I thought that it would be, I didn't know what to think it would be, but I was really positively surprised at the conversations that it continues to generate, because I think that even though it doesn't have that sort of tangible form, the objects are still recognizable. And because it's made to the same scale, it still has that same presence. And so I'll still recommend, if people have the opportunity to go and see the original, there are parts that you just can't replicate. But I'm really happy with the exhibit, and I'm so happy that it gets to continue to travel, because it was planned for the original to come there before we realized that it wouldn't last that long. So this way gives us a chance to, in some manner, bring it, continue that sort of promise of bringing it back where all the pieces came from.
For sure. And it still allows us to, continue the longevity of telling these stories, and even for us here at the gallery with the school tours and many other tour groups that come through it, it may not be the original objects, but it's still continuing that storytelling and those steps towards truth and reconciliation, which we very much appreciate being able to do here. So let's see, I'll maybe just do one more question, and I'll let you get back to your family. We've got one here from Linda. It says, hello, Carey, can you tell us about the braids of hair on the piece with the objects from your family? Let's connect it back to your family to end things off.
That's a lovely way to end this conversation. The braids are from my sister's hair. When I first found out that I was going to get to make this blanket, my wife Elaine said, maybe your sisters could do this. She's really good at coming up with ideas that mean a lot of work for others. And we asked them, and they said they would. And so from before the blanket was ever started, they began growing their hair. And then the reason that the hair is on there is because one of the stories, we didn't hear a lot of stories from my father about his experience at residential school, but one of them was that the first day he went there, they shaved his head. And this was an experience that was repeated over and over across this country. And it was part of a way, part of the goal of assimilation, part of part of removing identity. And it's something that's happened in a lot of different human atrocities, where shaving of heads is is dehumanizing in a way. So he had shared that with us. And so my sisters thought that they would grow their hair and cut it in honor of all of the survivors who had their hair cut. Even doing it with intention and with their own consent and commitment, and being able to do it through ceremony, where they prepared 4 days of early morning shakwams or baths in cold water at the break of dawn, to prepare themselves for cutting the hair, and then going through the ceremonial cutting of hair, and then doing 4 days of prayers at sunrise over their hair to remove their spirit from it. They both talk about how incredibly powerful an experience it is to have your hair cut, and how much it shifted their own identities and their own thinking about their femininity, about their privacy, about all of the different ways that people use hair, right? You can cover your eyes if you aren't interested in talking to somebody on the bus. You pull it out of your coat when you put on a jacket, and there's just all these different things that were different, that were suddenly changed for them. And they talk about that if you have a chance to watch the documentary. And I think that you can probably share a link to it for anybody who hasn't seen it. But they talk about that experience in the documentary, and we sort of follow that process. And it was they are together. The braids of hair are together on the witness blanket, on either side of the branch from the cedar tree, or sorry, from the apple tree at St. Mary's. So it's kind of a little box that is filled with objects from our family.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing those stories with us, Carey, and thanks again for your time this evening. I really appreciate it. There's many words of thanks and appreciation coming through. I'd also like to thank the Canadian Museum for Human Rights for the development and circulation of the exhibition that we're able to show, as well as many of our community partners, Central Okanagan Public Schools, Kelowna Museums, Okanagan Indian Bands, Finchwick Heritage Museum, Silks Okanagan Nation Alliance, West Bank First Nation, and UBC Okanagan. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Carey. If you'd like to see the documentary, I believe it's also posted up on our website. If you would like to see a recording of Carey's talk at a later date, it should be up on our website within the coming days as well. So thank you so much, and have a great evening, Carey.
Thank you so much. I just posted the link in the chat for anybody who wants to click on it before we officially say goodbye. But thanks for your questions. It's been really great. So have a good evening.
Excellent. Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye now.